My talk is called What Made a Church Sacred in Late Antiquity? Two Different Views and the Tension Between Them. A hospice alongside a river, an altar inside a church. These are the places where John Chrysostom became a predecessor to Robin Hood. Thief in the eyes of some, philanthropist in the eyes of others. John Chrysostom, his supporters, and his enemies engaged in a rhetorical battle over how to imagine these two places. John Chrysostom and his supporters imagined the riverside and the urban church as places of sacred charity. I will first turn our attention to the regulative practices of jurists and bishops. I will argue that jurists and bishops created a view of sacred property as divinely protected and to some extent divinely protecting things. Then I will contrast the juristic view of sacred space with a liturgical one. Finally, I will show that when John Chrysostom was accused of violating the juristic image of sacred space, he and his supporters responded by invoking the liturgical image of sacrality. John Chrysostom and his supporters engaged their opponents by painting verbal images of contested ecclesiastical landscapes. Which places are sacred? What does it mean for a place to be sacred? Roman jurists had very specific answers to these questions. Gaius, a Roman lawyer of the 2nd century, spelled out clearly what a sacred thing is and what it means for it to be sacred in a textbook he wrote for his law students. In this textbook, Gaius said, "The main division of things can be said to have two limbs. Some things are under divine law, others under human law. Sacred and religious things, for instance, are under divine law. Sacred things are those consecrated to the gods above. Now, what is under divine law belongs to no one." Gaius explained basic principles of Roman law. All inanimate things either fell under human law or divine law. Under divine law were res sacri, sacred things, things ritually consecrated to gods, such as temples. Everything ritually consecrated to the gods, every sacred thing, belonged to no one. No one could own a sacred thing. Instead, sacred things were divinely protected. Justinian would have a new textbook of Roman law composed in the 6th century that rewrote earlier textbooks with reference to Christian practices. Justinian expressed principles similar to those of Gaius with these words: "Things belonging to no one are sacred things, for what belongs to heaven is part of no man's estate. Sacred things are those properly consecrated to God by the bishops, holy churches, for instance, and gifts duly dedicated to the service of God. Sacred things, like churches consecrated by bishops, belong to no one." While Justinian seems to have been the first to have a legal textbook replace references to traditional Roman religious practices with Christian ones, jurists and bishops in the 4th and 5th centuries were already, in fact, treating churches as sacred things. Since sacred things were consecrated to God, divinely protected, and owned by no one, they could not be the object of any transaction, such as a sale, a donation, an exchange, a bequest, and so on. In other words, ecclesial property could not be alienated. Some jurists express this principle by drawing a parallel between sacred things and free persons. Slaves could be sold, donated, exchanged, bequeathed, and so on, but not free persons. It was just as impossible to sell a sacred thing as it was to sell a free person. A canon from the council at Carthage in 419 made reference to the ban on alienating ecclesial property. Emperors Leo and Anthemius in 470 would invoke the eternity of the church to justify the inalienability of sacred property. Quote, "The property that belongs to the blessed church must be reverently kept intact, just as the holy and sacred church herself, so that as she is the eternal mother of religion and faith, so her property should be perpetually preserved unimpaired." Unquote. Leo and Anthemius personify the church as a mother who bears faith as her child. Because she is eternal, it follows that her child faith and her property, church buildings and lands, should also be eternal. What then does one do with things so divinely protected as church property? Bishops had an answer to this question and lobbied for legal support of it. Bishops advocated that the church's divine protection should be extended to those in need. A council at Antioch in 328 prioritized the poor among those in need. A canon describing the primary administrative duty of bishops explained that every bishop was to administer ecclesial property for the benefit of the poor, not for personal gain or for any other purpose. Bishops succeeded in lobbying for laws that regulated 3 specific ways in which ecclesial property might offer protection. Already in the 4th century, Constantine recognized churches as places where slaves could be manumitted publicly. Second, and this is pertinent to the case of John Chrysostom, churches could protect criminals and refugees by granting them asylum. Someone in need could flee to the church, embrace the altar, and request of the bishop that he intercede with authorities to mitigate the penalty the person should face. So, for example, a convict facing capital punishment could seek refuge at a church to have a bishop negotiate with the judge to reduce the sentence. Bishops issued canons affirming the authority of churches to grant asylum to all who sought it, thus seeking to protect both refugees and ecclesial administrators from the fugitives' prosecutors. Jurists, on the other hand, promulgated laws to limit the populations eligible for asylum, to draw the spatial boundaries of ecclesial property on which asylum may be granted, and to hold ecclesial administrators responsible for bypassing civil procedure. The exact privileges of the church expanded and contracted depending on the period. As contested as the details of asylum were, suffice it to say that asylum was a legally and canonically recognized way in which churches spread the wings of divine protection over those in need. The asylum of refugees and the manumission of slaves did not require the alienation of ecclesial property. Repurposing ecclesial property remained difficult. By the 6th century, there would be legal recognition of the need to amass large sums for the ransom of captives. It became possible to repurpose ecclesial property, even to melt down a golden chalice for the sole purpose of ransoming captives. In the 4th century, Ambrose of Milan admitted to melting down vessels to ransom captives, and Ambrose defended his action. However, at the time, what Ambrose did with res sacrae was in fact illegal, but Ambrose did not suffer any penalties for it. As we will see, John Chrysostom did pay the price for his alienation of ecclesial property. Legally, then, res sacrae were divinely protected and therefore inalienable. That divine protection could be extended to those in need, provided that this did not entail the alienation or repurposing of ecclesial property. Speakers, especially in liturgical contexts, regularly undercut this principle of alienability. As Ambrose of Milan told his clergy in defense of his own act of alienation, the church has gold not to preserve it for itself, but to dispense it. What made a church sacred was how it treated the needy. Preaching this often involved the illustration of allegories, such as the story of Saint Laurentius. In the late 4th century, a person named Prudentius left a life of legal practice and political posts behind to write Christian literary works. One of them was a poem celebrating the martyr Laurentius, who was executed in 258 when Christian practice was illicit in the Roman Empire. Prudentius imagines how the prefect of Rome and Laurentius interacted when the prefect ordered the confiscation of the church treasury for which Laurentius was responsible. In Prudentius's poem, Laurentius promises to perform a proper inventory in the course of 3 days, and then to hand over the ecclesial property. When the prefect arrives at the appointed time, Laurentius announces to the prefect, "Marvel at the wealth set out before you, which our exceeding rich God has in his sanctuaries. You will see the great nave gleaming with vessels of gold, and along the open colonnades course on course of precious metal." With this imagined speech, Prudentius retrojects late 4th and early 5th century expectations of what the interior of a great church in the city of Rome would look like into the mid-3rd century. When the prefect enters through the church doors, he is startled to see, quote, "crowds of poor people standing, a disfigured swarm," unquote, and hear the loud din of their appeals to him. Laurentius explains, "Here then are the golden coins which a short while ago I promised, coins which tumbling walls cannot bury under burning ashes, nor thief carry away by stealth. And now I give you noble jewels also, so that you need not think Christ is poor, jewels of flashing light with which this temple is adorned. You see the consecrated virgins and marvel at the pure old women who, after the loss of their first husbands, have known no second love. These are the church's necklace, the jewels with which she decks herself. Thus dowered she is pleasing to Christ, and thus she adorns her high head. There are her riches, take them up. With them you will adorn the city of Romulus and enrich the emperor's estate, and yourself be made richer too." Laurentius claims that the true wealth of the church consists of the poor and the widows. To the prefect, Laurentius offers the poor as the golden coins and the widows as the shimmering jewels. In a rage, the prefect exclaims, "We are being deceived to a stupendous extent through so many allegories." Prudentius's imagined confrontation between Laurentius and the prefect dramatically captures conflicts that occurred again and again in the 4th and 5th centuries. However, the struggles were not between ecclesial stewards and city prefects. Instead, bishops wishing to perform acts of mercy confronted donors who wished to protect their ecclesial donations legally. The inalienability of ecclesial property clashed with the bishop's primary duty to care for the poor. One example of such a confrontation is told of Rabula, bishop of Edessa in the 5th century. According to Rabula's hagiographer, Rabula tried to repurpose ecclesial property, but the donor's heirs prevented him. The story reads, Rabula straightway ordered that many silver vessels, which had been fashioned with care for the serving of 10 tables of clerics, be sold. He distributed equitably the price they fetched for the use of the needy. He gently persuaded the clerics to use clay vessels. He also determined to sell the liturgical vessels of silver and gold, which the churches had, and to give the prices they fetched to the poor. As he said, "It is clear to those who know that adorned liturgical vessels of gold and silver are not especially necessary for the glory of God, but that the Spirit of God rests in pure hearts." Yet his order was neglected because of their contempt. At the request of many, he was restrained from doing this because the vessels were the offering of their earlier, now deceased fathers, who had offered them to God for the redemption of their spirit. The character in this story, Rabula of Edessa, did not himself dine with silver dishes. Rabula preferred the use of less expensive ceramic vessels because he did not believe that gold and silver were necessary for expressing or communicating the glory of God. Rabula argued that God does not need silver or gold dishes either, because the more valuable temple and place of God's dwelling is that of pure hearts. So Rabula tried to repurpose consecrated silver and gold vessels to support the poor, but his effort was thwarted. According to the hagiographer, Rabula's opponents thought the act of repurposing liturgical vessels in the service of the poor would interfere with the deceased donor's exchange with God. The deceased donors gave the vessels, quote, "to God for the redemption of their spirit," unquote. Repurposing the vessels, the opponents imagined, would interfere with this exchange. So Rabula was not permitted to repurpose the sacred things. Both jurists and bishops imagined ecclesial landscapes as sacred places. Jurists and bishops engaged in regulative practices to make churches places of divine protection, places that no one could own or alienate. At the same time, it was the bishop's duty to administer ecclesial property for the benefit of the poor, criminals, refugees, and all those in need. In fact, according to liturgical allegories, the needy were the real wealth of the church. The needy were the inalienable res sacri. As a bishop, John Chrysostom acted in accordance with the liturgical view, but paid the penalty for violating the juristic one. John's accusers charged him with alienating ecclesial property and illegally administering asylum, thereby committing violence against the image of churches as divinely protected and protecting places. To resist the portrayal of John as a sacrilegious administrator, John himself and his supporters used a specific rhetorical strategy. They created vivid landscapes for their audiences to visualize. Verbal images of an altar defended John from the charges relating to asylum, while the depiction of a riverside hospice rebutted charges concerning the alienation of sacred property. The few sources that we have from John's opponents emphasize the importance they attached to charges of sacrilege. One source is a summary that Photius of Constantinople wrote in the 9th century of the proceedings of John Chrysostom's trial. According to the summary, 4 charges accused John Chrysostom of alienating ecclesial property. John sold valuable sacred vessels. He sold slabs of marble that one of his predecessors left for the church called Holy Resurrection. He sold a testamentary donation left to the church. And he displaced ecclesial revenue. Another source survives in a quotation preserved in the 6th century writings of Facundus of Hermione. Facundus cites Jerome's Latin translation of a book Theophilus of Alexandria composed to defend the justice of John Chrysostom's deposition. Theophilus was one of the judges who presided over John Chrysostom's trial. According to Facundus, Theophilus said that John Chrysostom surpassed the audacity of thieves in his crime and was chief among those who commit sacrilege. Facundus does not provide any further detail on Theophilus's position vis-a-vis John Chrysostom's administration of ecclesial property, but the few words quoted suggest that Theophilus addressed the charges of sacrilege in his book. To rebut these charges, an anonymous orator who composed a funeral speech for John took his listeners on an imagined visit to a controversial building project, the construction of a riverside hospice. The mosaic on the screen actually shows the port city of Classe, but it is the best late antique juxtaposition of buildings and water that I could find. According to the orator, John wanted to house the poorest of the poor, lepers, the people that even the most pious would shun. So he began to build a riverside hospice for lepers. This is the place that John's supporter used to visually capture John's blameless administration and to shame John's accusers. To the orator, the unfinished lepers hospice both exonerates John and exposes the ulterior motives of his accusers. John focused his episcopal care on those who suffered from leprosy, quote, a disease that drives even a soul of steel to pity, but that scares away even the most philanthropic soul, unquote. John bought land with, quote, the finest air and a river flowing by, unquote, and began to build a hospice. But before the roof was installed, the project was halted. The river proved to be the most controversial aspect of the charitable building project. John specifically chose a riverside location so that the lepers could easily cleanse their sores. But his opponents convinced neighbors down the river that the waters would be polluted and fill their properties with pus and disease. According to the orator, John's opponents transformed the sacred charitable landscape that John had envisioned into an unfinished project that could have only spread pollution. The orator sought to effect a visual shift in the minds of the listeners. In John's hands, the landscape consists of fine air and a river and spreads mercy to those persons most shunned. In the hands of his opponents, however, the landscape turns into an unfinished, abandoned building that could have only spread disease had it been finished. How did John's opponents succeed in halting the project? According to the orator, they claimed that John amassed funds for the hospice by alienating ecclesial property. After reviewing the charges, the orator says, "Those who said these things, my friends, were those who had found fault with that great expenditure of his for the lepers, and had laid hold of it, or rather seized it by fraud. Their minds hated and their tongues slandered his great love for beggars, pretending vainly to love their fellow men by falsely accusing him of misappropriating funds intended for beggars." The orator and another supporter, Palladius, admit that John Chrysostom did redirect ecclesial assets for the purpose of building the hospice. The orator argues that it was in John's ecclesiastical powers to use the funds as he did, and cites precedent in the West for such episcopal actions. By contrast, Palladius uses the rhetorical strategy of imagining landscapes in his dialogue on the life of John Chrysostom. Palladius creates a foil of a landscape by comparing John Chrysostom's charitable use of church property to Theophilus's lithomania in building excessively luxurious sites. According to Palladius, bishops like Theophilus, quote, squander money that rightly belongs to the poor in hanging walls and water cisterns 3 stories high, and disgraceful baths for effeminate men all hidden away, or expend their money on buildings uselessly, unquote. John Chrysostom's supporters rhetorically created visual landscapes to depict John Chrysostom as a bishop who stopped at nothing to fulfill his primary duty as bishop, to care for the needy. For the orator, the very same image that exonerated John painted his opponents in the unfavorable light of selfish motives. For Palladius, the juxtaposition of a hospice with excessively luxuriant sites put John in the company of the pious, while leaving Theophilus with questionable motives. John Chrysostom's opponents not only faulted him with failure to maintain church property as divinely protected things, they also claimed that he failed to extend that divine protection to those in need. In addition to the 4 charges concerning the alienation of church property, another 4 charges regarded the issue of asylum. John Chrysostom was said to have granted asylum to an ineligible person, a pagan who harmed Christians, and to have failed to protect 3 eligible refugees, a comes by the name of John, and 2 otherwise unknown presbyters. The pagan and the comes were 2 high-profile figures, whose asylum John Chrysostom anticipated would be controversial. Before any charges were ever formally leveled against him, John preached homilies that defended his discretionary decisions. These homilies employ the same rhetorical strategy that John's supporters would later use. John invites his listeners to imagine his episcopal landscape as sacred, as protecting. The pagan in question was Eutropius, a grand chamberlain instrumental in passing legislation to declare certain types of people ineligible for ecclesial asylum and to prevent ecclesial asylum from contravening civil procedure. When this same Eutropius sought ecclesial asylum at John Chrysostom's church, John expected that there would be many who would consider Eutropius unworthy of asylum and who would object to John's reception of Eutropius in the sanctuary. As Eutropius clung to the altar before the eyes of all, John Chrysostom preached a homily. The manuscript illumination on the screen actually depicts Gregory Nazianzen consecrating an altar, but it was the best illustration I could find to capture the drama of Eutropius grasping the altar in Constantinople. John responded to anticipated objections from the crowd by creating a vivid verbal picture for the audience to project imaginatively over the image at hand, Eutropius at the altar. John Chrysostom describes the church as a winged, protective creature whose embrace of Eutropius can transform him into a luminous ornament for the altar, provided that the audience joins John in an act of intercession. Although Eutropius had attacked the church, now that he is in need of protection, the church hastens to snatch him out of the fishing net, to hold him securely under its wings and in its bosom, and to bear its shield before him. With the church's power and philanthropy, Eutropius can himself become a sacred piece of property, an ornament for the altar that emits great light. Despite Eutropius's faults, he would not defile the altar any more than the impure woman of Luke 23, verse 34, defiled Jesus in grasping his feet. John Chrysostom therefore invites his audience to join him so that together as intercessors they might adorn the church with Eutropius the luminous ornament by appealing the emperor for mercy toward him. In the case of the comes named John, objections to John Chrysostom's actions were of the opposite nature. that he did not grant asylum to a refugee. John Chrysostom preached a homily defending himself against the allegation that he failed to ensure the church's protection to the Comes John when he sought asylum during a military coup. John Chrysostom argues that he did not deny John asylum. Rather, the Comes left the church premises of his own accord. Had he clung to the altar, he would not have been arrested. John Chrysostom reuses the same gospel analogy of asylum and the same aerial image of the church's protection he had employed in his homily on Eutropius the previous year. The sinful woman of the Gospels clung to Jesus' feet and was saved as a result. Likewise, the Comes John would have been saved had he clung to the altar. John Chrysostom insists that the church's protection is eternal, ascending up beyond the heavens. The ever-victorious church would have protected the Comes John if only he had remained in it. One rhetorical image, that of an altar transformed into a winged protective creature, defended John Chrysostom from accusations that he improperly extended the church's divine protection. Another rhetorical image, that of a hospice at a fine and pure riverside location, defended John Chrysostom from the accusations that he alienated ecclesial property. Both John Chrysostom and his supporters created and disseminated depictions of John Chrysostom's ecclesial landscapes as the epitome of divine protection. In their accounts, John's use of ecclesial funds fit the liturgical view. John helped the poorest of the poor, and he did not hesitate to give everyone the opportunity to take shelter under the protective wings of the church. And not only did John Chrysostom offer asylum to all those who sought it, but he went above and beyond. He offered refugees themselves the chance to be transformed into sacred things, to become luminous ornaments at God's altar. The case of John Chrysostom shows the fine line between acts of mercy and accusations of sacrilege in the early church. From the perspective of his accusers, John Chrysostom practiced sacrilege against ecclesial property by alienating it, by denying its protection to a Comes, and by granting its protection to an ineligible person. From the perspectives of his defenders, including himself, he practiced mercy by using ecclesial property for the benefit of the disabled and every refugee, regardless of his or her faults. Imagined landscapes served as the battlefields on which the dispute over John Chrysostom's administration was fought. Bishops, acting as agents in both regulatory and liturgical contexts, envisioned sacred landscapes in a contest over the purpose of res sacrae. Thus, John Chrysostom, his opponents, and his supporters participated in this wider negotiation regarding what divine protection looked like in the world and what it meant for ecclesial property to be sacred. Indeed, in this way, John's own public image as an Episcopal Robin Hood, a thief in the eyes of some, a philanthropist in the eyes of others, was determinatively shaped by a rhetoric of sacred space connected with a hospice by a river and an altar in a church. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you so much, Mary. Can we open the floor, please, to questions? José, please.
Thank you, Mary, so much for your very kind and generous presentation. And there's something which was certainly in the back of my mind as you spoke of the protection provided by the church institution, which goes back to the understanding of you find in Augustine, which you mentioned in your book, by the way, the protection, the security of the city of God, which is prefigured by the building of the church, providing that eternal hope, that eternal home that we hope for, certainly the eternal home that Augustine mentions. And that home, of course, the church is the home for the baptized, which are allowed to enter it and celebrate in it, that are reborn into Christ through baptism, and that thereby become part of the body of Christ himself, the mystical body of the church. At that point, the image of the Mother of God becomes, I think, quite crucial, as she holds in her womb the living God, the incarnate living God, and provides protection for all those who dwell in the church. So one of the things that came to my mind as you were speaking was that wonderful hymn, Sub tuum presidium confugimus, of which I'm sure there is a Greek version. I'm not sure of the date, and I'm not sure anybody is sure of that date, but it certainly goes back to early Christianity. Under your protection, we assemble, and that hymn places us all under the security, under the mantle of Mary, the Mother of God, Theotokos, as I'm sure the Greek version mentions, and that I think also takes me back to a particular passage in the Gospels that speaks of that clothing, as it were, of the Christian with love. And if there is one word which I think it provides a key to your presentation, that word I think is love. So one passage that came to my mind certainly is the one in Colossians 3:14, to provide you a chapter and verse. Put on love, which is the bond of perfect unity. So put on love. That goes back to a few verses there back in that chapter. So clothe yourself with love. It's more of a comment than a question, but I wonder if that might be helpful also to support your argument. From what I could see in your presentation now, but also in your book, there are three different aspects to this adornment of Christian life, which you find reflected also in the architecture, in the images. One is to teach the faithful. Those are mysteries that pertain to the celebrations of the Eucharist and the various festivals of the Church. Another one is to rise, really, the souls to the practice of those feats, heroic feats of the saints and the life of the saints, and namely by succor to the poor and the poorest to the poor, as you so rightly mentioned. And in so doing, avoid distractions, namely by avoiding references to narratives, fables, and stories, and so on, that do not pertain to that practice. But I think in there you find two aspects of one same exercise in striving for perfection. One which is the perfection of Christian life, of course, and in that perfection, the unity. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'd very much appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Yes, I didn't go into the research on the application or the reason why jurists in the 2nd century and earlier created this idea of sacred things. that was generated for pagan, so non-Christian, non-Jewish, just traditional Greco-Roman cult. They generated these legal concepts for those places. That's what they had in mind when they generated these definitions. And so I think what you're pointing to is the difficulty that especially bishops faced once Christianity entered the legal sphere, being considered a licit religion. How then churches were slotted into this concept of sacred thing, because it didn't quite line up with what churches had been doing for the last 3 centuries before Constantine, and wanted to continue doing in the coming time. And so you have, I think, the disjuncture between what churches had been doing without oversight from Roman law, because all of these places were technically illegal, all the churches beforehand. But after Constantine allows Christian practice, then the issue is, well, what is the status of these places? And once you start applying this idea of sacred thing to them, it sort of constrains bishops and prevents them from doing certain things they consider their primary duty, and hence the tension. So in the book, I use the image of like tectonic plates where, they fit and usually everything's fine. So as long as we're not repurposing ecclesial property to do anything, the legal view and the liturgical view happily coexist. But once there starts to be some action along that colliding boundary, then we get a real eruption and quite an earthquake, as in the case with John Chrysostom, but he's not the only one, with others too. So when ecclesial property does get repurposed, it really sort of shakes society in a lot of ways. And I think you're absolutely right to point to, the foundation of this in the scriptures, and then also this general idea of what it means to like create adornments of the Christian life, the 3 that you mentioned. And I think the challenge is holding on to that while also being slotted into this category of sacred thing.
Thank you. I think we're still struggling, and Father Peter can perhaps correct me with that, with the alienation of church property. We still can't do it. And it's a very practical problem that we face every time we're dealing with church property. So that's alive and very much, happening. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Christian, you were raising your hand, please.
Yes, I was interested in, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Mary. One of the issues of John of Chrysostom is he was obviously around the time of the Arian controversy, or was certainly engaged, as far as I understand it, on the fringes, or was accused of it at some point. But I'm interested in the relationship between the idea of the church itself in the monophysite and the more orthodox understanding, and whether the notion of res sacra differed in those two slightly conflicting ways of seeing the world.
Thank you for your question. Just briefly on John Chrysostom, I think you might be thinking of the Origenist controversy, which is a very complicated controversy for scholars to really unravel. It's, by name ostensibly about Origen, but it seems to be far more complicated than that. And Theophilus does, part of the issue, the theological issue, let's say, against John Chrysostom was this charge of Origenism. And so that is part of the picture here that I'm sort of leaving aside. But turning now to, you mentioned the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian. So in the final chapter of the book, I get into this. We have a situation post the Council of Chalcedon in 451, where you have a group that's resisting the council strongly. So what happens at the Council of Chalcedon is that you have Palestinian monks who leave the council and make it a point to go back to Jerusalem and prevent Juvenal of Jerusalem, the bishop of the city at the time, from returning. That's their standoff. They keep him out of the city for 20 months. We can go into the reasons for the opposition to Chalcedon if we like, but for the purposes of my work, what was interesting to me is that as a result of this schism, which goes on, so Juvenal of Jerusalem is forcibly reinstated after 20 months, and it's and non-Chalcedonians sort of have to renegotiate their relationship to Jerusalem as a result, because they decisively lose Jerusalem, and you don't have another non-Chalcedonian bishop of that city, period. There was just that one opponent whose name was Theodosius of Jerusalem. That's the one non-Chalcedonian bishop of Jerusalem, and that's it. So there's this loss of like the place with the holy places, the sacred things par excellence, because by the 5th century, Jerusalem was replete, with its holy sites, and even a liturgical calendar for celebrating festivals at these sites. And so part of what non-Chalcedonians had to deal with is expulsion from Jerusalem, and therefore, had their relationship to those holy sites. And so what I argue is that, so there's that, so that's one issue, their relationship to those holy sites. And then secondly, technically speaking, their churches are not considered sacred by the imperial government because, they're resisting the official church. And so they have to deal with these two things. And when it comes to recognizing their own places as sacred, what I see them doing through the narratives I discuss is that they're sort of pulling the rug out from under this definition of sacred thing and saying, we don't need imperial authority to like rubber stamp our consecrated churches. Then they bypass that altogether and say, we have the authority of Christ the King. Christ is our King, and Christ, himself consecrated some of these places. That's how the stories go, that Christ comes down and consecrates them. So in other words, we bypass the imperial authority, and we're still working with that same definition of sacred thing. It's got to be consecrated to God by a bishop. But the key here is that we don't need emperors. Christ basically is our emperor. So there's that reaction, a very strong reaction, basically saying our sites are still sacred, even if the imperial authorities deny that. And then when it comes to Jerusalem, there's both a longing for Jerusalem and a wish to stay away from it. So for example, Peter the Iberian, who was a major leader of the non-Chalcedonian cause, he's said to have gone to just outside the walls of Jerusalem, and instead of going in, he undertakes a spiritual pilgrimage into Jerusalem. So he goes in spirit, not in body. And then with the text that I discuss, we have actually the making of Egypt more robustly into a holy land with an itinerary for the Holy Family's visit to Egypt when Christ was an infant. And so the idea is that we have a very holy land here in Egypt, where Christ himself, tread all along, from the north of the Nile Valley down all the way south. This is our holy land. There's no need to go out to Jerusalem, to Chalcedonianville. We have our holy land here. So sort of the experiential reaction to the reality of the schism, I see being worked out through certain non-Chalcedonian homilies. Did
it affect the iconography of the buildings?
Well, that's a great question. So the issue of cause, I think, is a very hard one to track, but I don't think, I'm not sure I could make this case, you know, very well, but I do have sort of the inkling that the way we see Chalcedonian, like say Eastern Orthodox churches today versus Oriental Orthodox ones, I do think we might be seeing the imprint of the controversy in the iconography, in that especially in Egypt, for the book of Revelation and apocalyptic in general really takes off. And there, and in the wake of Chalcedon, you have non-Chalcedonian bishops talking about the situation as if, you know, the one says that it befits the advent of the Antichrist, you know, so apocalypse is sort of on the mind. And what you typically have in the Eastern apse of Coptic churches is Revelation. So Christ enthroned, and the 12 elders beside the throne, the incorporeal creatures. It's a very apocalyptic way of seeing the altar, and seeing the sanctuary as this space of like entering that ultimate revelation. Whereas I'm not familiar with any Eastern Orthodox churches that will derive their depictions for the sanctuary from the book of Revelation.
Thank you.
But again, I can't say I can prove that. It's just sort of you know, having done this work and experiencing those spaces today, which do go back historically to you know, the apses having that kind of imagery. I don't know if we can say there's like cause and effect going on here, or more of sort of reinterpreting images in the light of experience.
I think the important concept here, which you also mentioned in your book, is the idea of archiropoietos, so the made by the hand of God, which is quite crucial for non-Chalcedonian churches, communities. So maybe you'd like to, well, I'm not going to explain what you said in your book, so you might as well complete that if you wish, but I think it's quite crucial, you know, what effect does it affect the iconography? Does it affect well, it does, in the sense that it touches on the very nature of how it is conceived. If you'd like to say something about that very quickly.
That you're absolutely right. So in one of the stories that I discuss, it's attributed to Basil of Caesarea, but pseudonymously. It's a Coptic homily about a church dedicated to Mary in Philippi, and this word figures into the text, archiropoietos, so not made by human hands. And this is a way that the sacrality of the church, of non-Chalcedonian churches, is really secured by saying that the churches are not made by human hands. There are these miracles involved in the physical existence of the church. So for the case of that church in Philippi, the idea that there's specifically a mosaic of Mary that's considered archiropoietos, so not made by human hands. And that's the primary sort of, that homily really hones in on that mosaic. And then there's another homily attributed to Theophilus of Alexandria, again, not written by him, but it's about a church in Koskam, Egypt, which is the farthest south in Egypt, where the Holy Family is thought to have stayed. They're thought to have stayed there for the longest stretch of their time in Egypt. I mean, their longest stretch of time in one place. They're there for 3.5 years. Through exegesis of Revelation, that's how we arrive at 3.5 years. And for 3 years, they're really just going from place to place, but then there's this 1 6-month stay at the Church of Koskam. And the word archiropoietos is not used, but there is a very strong emphasis on the fact that this cave where the Holy Family stayed had never been touched by human hands. Maybe, you know, unfortunately, we don't have Coptic text for this homily. It was translated from Coptic into Arabic. Maybe if we had the Coptic, it would say archiropoietos. But in Arabic, we have perhaps the translation of that by saying, no human ever touched or dwelt in this place. Christ and his family stayed there for 6 months, and then before his ascension, he came back and consecrated himself as a church. So yes, you're absolutely right to point out that this idea of the place really going beyond human touch and skill, it becomes an important idea for non-Chalcedonians. For Chalcedonians too, I have to say, there's a rich amount of literature about this idea of acheropoietos. And I didn't go into this for the book, but when I was studying the homilies that I did, I wondered to what extent there's narrative and counter narrative going on between Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians over sacred places, with this idea of the acheropoietos figuring prominently.
Yes, I think there we're dealing with the stuff of legend and devotion, not with doctrine, church doctrine. But thank you again.
Thank you. I think that's been the most wonderful hour. Thank you, Mary, for opening for me personally a lot of clarifications, and I look forward to revisiting these particular churches and texts. Thanks so much indeed. So farewell for now, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.